And for more analysis, we're joined from Cairo by Mohammed Osman, International Relations Specialist, and from Damascus by Sheher al-Sheher, International Relations Professor at Sun Yat-sen University. A very warm welcome to both our distinguished guests. Mr. Osman, a very good day, and I want to start with you asking you, Netanyahu's visit to occupation army positions inside Syria came amidst stalled negotiations. How did you read this move, and what does this timing reveal about Israel's strategic signaling toward both Washington and Damascus?
Thank you for having me, Rana. Always a pleasure to be with you, and greetings to you and to your audience. It seems that Israel, of course, is carrying out yet another provocation in a blatant violation of Syrian sovereignty. As you very well know, Rana, since the collapse of the Assad regime in December 2024, Israel took it upon itself to, first of all, completely degrade all of Syria's military infrastructure through massive airstrikes. And afterwards, they carried out incursions that turned into land acquisitions in Syria, capturing from 600 to 1,000 square kilometers of Syrian territories beyond the occupied Golan Heights, which has been occupied since 1967, and it is Syrian territory according to international law. They captured even more land, and now they are creating the so-called buffer zone. And they captured strategic areas, including, of course, Jabal al-Sheikh, and Israeli forces even carry out incursions beyond the areas they occupied, reaching the suburbs or the countryside of Damascus, villages like Qatana. So it seems that Syria's sovereignty has become completely non-existent for the Israelis. And of course, Netanyahu carrying out yet another visit to these occupied Syrian lands. And it's not the first, by the way. He did visit Jabal al-Sheikh before a few months back, last year, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and he is repeating that once more. Of course, this comes with the difficulties in the negotiations in hindsight between Israel and Syria. They have engaged in both indirect and direct negotiations mediated by countries like the United States, of course, primarily, but also Azerbaijan, in order to reach, to begin with, a security agreement and later on even a peace agreement and a normalization agreement. The Israelis have been very steadfast that they are demanding a demilitarized southern Syria, certain guarantees for the Druze and Suhaida, which they are using as a bargaining chip, unfortunately. And also they are insisting that Syria should normalize unconditionally and even recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which of course is inconceivable to the Syrian side. The Syrian side was willing to forego the Golan Heights, according to reports, as a precondition for peace. They were willing to move forward with the security agreement and peace. However, they do believe that the concessions that the Israelis are demanding are way too exaggerated. Of course, this is the tax Syria is paying due to over a decade of civil war and internal strife has turned Syria basically into a land that is now up for grabs by many foreign powers, including Israel, unfortunately. And unfortunately as well, the United States and the international community seem to be unwilling to put any pressure on Israel so that it would stop its violation of Syrian sovereignty and, of course, international law by consequence.
Mr. Sheher, Damascus condemned Netanyahu's visit as an illegal entry to seized land. How does this reflect Syria's negotiation posture under President Ahmed al-Shara?
طبعا مساء الخير.
Good evening, of course, as it is very clear here that Netanyahu, ever since the previous administration, all they've been having continued aggressions in Syria, and they haven't stopped. It destroyed the Syrian army, and then there were peace talks between Syria and Israel, and now Netanyahu is visiting southern Syria, and this is, in my opinion, an escalation. And the goal here is to impose a new reality. He says that he doesn't want to have a security agreement between Israel and Syria. He wants a full-on peace plan, and this means that Syria has to compromise or give up Julan, and the Syrian government just wants to have a security agreement and to have Israel withdraw from the lands that they have occupied. And now also we have a problem. Why did Netanyahu come now? He basically escaped. He is facing charges now in court because of several crimes, and so he came here with the chief of army, and he basically was escaping a court. And now in Konaitra, around about 40 kilometers away from the month, and around an hour ago there were Israeli strikes or an Israeli aggression, and this means that Israeli drones have actually crossed the borders, and now we are facing a catastrophe basically. And what's coming is the diplomatic situation in Syria. Enough now, people are getting more angry, especially the people who live in these areas. Homes are being violated, and some civilians are being abducted even, and there is some kind of civilian or national resistance. And also there are threats when Israel wants to impose such borders in Syria. The Syrian government said what happens if there are attacks from Israel from this area. So if does the Syrian government has something to do with this? And so I think that Syria still depending on USA's decision, especially Trump, but we haven't heard any statements when it comes to Netanyahu, and this shows that we may have more escalation.
Mr. Osman, Mr. Sheher mentioned now that escalation is imposed, and what's happening is escalation from the Israeli side, of course. New realities on the ground when Netanyahu went with his, of course, high-ranking officials, which I don't need to mention their names at this point, and that the people in this area specifically are facing, are really unhappy about what's happening, and he rounded up all by it is catastrophic what's happening. Your take, sir, and the talks broke down over core issues, which are total disarmament, an aid path into Swayda, and the future of the Golan. Which of these points do you see as the true deal breaker shaping each side's long-term strategy?
Israel is being a maximalist in its demands, basically. Israel is not willing to give the Syrian government any concession. And you know why, Rana? Because the Syrian government is weak, because they have no means by which they can coerce the Israelis or counter-pressure them, because the Syrian army has been disbanded after the fall of the Assad regime, because Syrian factions are still busy fighting one another over sectarian and religious issues, because Syria does not have the right set of alliances that can deter Israel. If anything, now Syria is building alliances with the allies of Israel, the United States, basically, and the West in general, and Turkey, the largest backer of the current administration in Syria, is rather unwilling to enter into a confrontation with Israel over the sovereignty of Syria. Israel wants the Golan Heights for good. The United States, President al-Shara was just in the United States and being greeted and welcomed to the White House. This very United States and this very President Trump, back in his first term, recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and now it is the United States official policy position that the Golan Heights are Israeli territories, which of course contravenes international law and goes against even the current Syrian government claims, which insist that the Golan Heights are a part of Syria, and they are a part of Syria, whether the Israelis would like to admit it or not. This is a fact. However, what is also a fact, the Golan Heights is controlled by Israel, settled by Israelis now, and is being treated as an integral part of Israel, and they're not going to abandon it or give it back to the Syrians under any conditions, given the current circumstances, unfortunately. Furthermore, the Israelis are demanding a demilitarized zone in the south, basically the southern parts of Damascus, whatever is left of Qanaitara unoccupied, parts of Dar'a, and also Al Suwaidah, where there is a secessionist movement led by Hikmat al Hajri and others, which is supported by Israel. So it seems
So,
that.
Mr. Mohammed Osman, sorry to interrupt you, but in this context, you read that, and your narrative is that an aid path into Swaidah is the main obstacle and is the main reason beyond what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet are doing at this point?
No, no, that's not the main reason. Because Suwaidah is just the bargaining chip. The Israelis are using Suwaidah as a bargaining chip to pressure the current Syrian administration. Believe me, Rana, I do, and I have the conviction that if Tel Aviv and Damascus come to an agreement, the Israelis will be more than happy to leave Suwaidah to its fate, basically. Let us. Israel will never be a friend of any component of any Arab society. The Druze, the Sunnis, Christians, the Israelis hate everyone equally, and they do view us as Arab peoples in general, the peoples of Egypt, Syria, with all of our different backgrounds. They see us as enemies, and this is something that we have to reckon with. So anyone who would bet that an alliance with
We're
Israel.
reckoning, sir, with it. I'll be back again with you, sir. Mr. Sheher, the proposed aid path to Swaidah was rejected by Damascus as a sovereignty breach. Why is Swaidah such a sensitive political insecurity symbol, sir, from your own narrative? Mr. Sheher, the proposed aid path to Swaidah was rejected by Damascus as a sovereignty breach. Why is Swaidah such a sensitive political insecurity symbol from your own narrative, sir, and perspective?
It doesn't have to do with the Suwaidah itself. He won when the crisis was in Suwaidah. They were talking about
Yes, and
ultimate
that
aid,
was
humanitarian statements from northern East Syria, and so to have a corridor from Qasr to Suwaidah and then from Suwaidah to Israel, and this is the wood corridor. But actually, Israel cannot resist the temptation that they can manipulate Syria's sovereignty. They know that there is a crisis in Suwaidah and in the coast also, even if it is less of a crisis than in Suwaidah. And so this is what they are trying to manipulate and take advantage of. And also, the West and USA welcoming Syria back is actually causing Israelis trouble. And then we know Turkey is supporting Syria, and they have conditioned that Israel said that they don't want to have any Turkish forces. And what we saw yesterday with the visit, we saw a new Russian we saw Russia deploying its forces again. But actually, Israel doesn't want this reality because it was actually implemented before, when Israel was justifying their actions that they have security concerns and that Syria cannot protect its borders, and the Israelis were in these areas, and they said that there is no need for an Israeli intervention. But now the Russian forces are being deployed again in the south, and this is not acceptable when it comes to Israel. But you have to know that Syria's unity is actually more safe for Israel than to have a fractured country. But I think that the Israeli government doesn't think strategically, but actually they think of their stance.
Mr. Osman, Syria negotiated the removal of heavy arms from South Syria, which is Israel's main demand. How does this calibrated flexibility reflect Damascus's broader regional approach under President Ahmed al-Shara?
I don't think that Syrian President al-Shara and the current Syrian administration have been vehemently opposed to the idea of disarming or demilitarizing southern Syria. It is a
Do
breach
they
of
have an option, sir?
But so far, it seems that they are steadfast, but as long as they are steadfast, they are still being subjected to Israeli violations. It doesn't seem that they have a choice at this point. However, it is commendable that they have not succumbed so far to the Israeli pressures and that they are insisting that they have to exercise sovereignty over their own territory. This is something that has to be commended. How long will this last? I don't know. However, if the United States completely sides with the Israeli side, I hardly find a scenario where an agreement could be reached without giving these concessions that are required by the Israelis. However, I wanted to point to something very important, Dr.
Please, sir.
Al-Shaher, because he mentioned the deployment of the Russians. The Russians have not been deployed yet. There have been talks. There was a security delegation from Turkey, Syria, and Russia, and they convened and they discussed the possibility of redeploying once again Russian observers or military police on their border posts with the Golan Heights. This has been discussed. It seems that Turkey, Syria, and Russia have agreed to that in principle. However, this has not been implemented yet for a very simple reason. Russia had about 9 outposts, if I'm not mistaken, along the border with the Golan Heights. About 6 of those now are under the control of Israel. Israel controls them, and Israel is using some of them and has destroyed the other outposts. So it would be very hard to imagine Russian forces being sent to areas controlled by the Israelis. This would lead to a conflict between the Israelis and the Russians, which is something that will not happen, and let's be realistic about it. However, we have seen that very recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu has spoken with President Vladimir Putin, and they discussed a variety of issues concerning the Middle East, Iran, and others, including the situation in Syria. So probably there might be a redeployment of the Russians once again as part of this understanding. And the deployment of Russian military forces during the years of the Assad regime was one of the main guarantors of the containment of Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty, which were limited to airstrikes against targets in Syria every now and then, but never incursions beyond the Golan Heights, which is not the case so far. And this is maybe why President al-Shara visited Moscow and has granted Moscow certain concessions, accepting in principle that the military bases in Syria would continue despite the very problematic history the current Syrian administration and Russia have, because they do understand that Russia might counterbalance the unlimited support the United States gives the Israelis. So Russia might play a very prominent role. I do agree with what Dr. Al-Shaher said at this point. However, to my knowledge, Russian forces have not been deployed yet.
So we're supposed to see, sir, and watch if Russia is going to act as a prominent role. And you think it's going to act as a prominent role in 1 second, because they want me to wrap now?
I think if they are allowed to and they reach certain understandings with the Israelis, they can play a very prominent role, yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Osman, International Relations Specialist, and Shaher al-Shaher, International Relations Professor at Sun Yat-sen University. Thank you very much for your insights, and this brings us to the end of today's episode of MTEB. Thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned for more updates at Qnews. I'm Rana Al-Qassas. Thank you for watching.